For $10, she bought a blacksmith's forge and his hidden confession, and by the time the truth was finished with her, an entire town would remember what it meant to be honest. She was 46 years old, and she had nothing. Her name had been struck from her late husband's land deed by his own brother, a man named Warwick Boone, who told the county clerk with a straight face that a widow had no head for property and no right to keep it. She left that house with a carpetbag, a mother's Bible, and $11 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat. She spent $1 on bread and coffee along the road, and when she arrived, dust-worn and hollow-eyed, in a fading mountain town called Larkspur Hollow, she had exactly $10 left in this world. And so, when the town clerk mentioned, almost as an afterthought, almost as a joke, that the old blacksmith's forge on Anvil Street was going for $10 because no one wanted it, because it had stood locked and silent for 11 years, because folks said the last smith who worked there had vanished in disgrace and left something rotten behind its cold hearth, she did not laugh. She paid every cent she had. Everyone in town called it the most foolish purchase a desperate woman ever made. They did not know that sealed behind a false brick in that forge's chimney was a confession that would restore not only her fortune, but the honor of a man wrongly hated for 11 long years, and the fortune of a town that did not yet know how much it had lost. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh. If you're listening from a place folks have written off as finished, tell us so in the comments. We'd like to know we're not the only ones who believe forgotten things still have worth. Odessa Marsh had been born in 1832 on a modest wheat farm outside of Independence, Missouri, the third of 5 children to a father who mended plows for half the county and a mother who kept the family solvent by taking in mending and, more quietly, by keeping the farm's account books with a precision that impressed even the bankers who visited twice a year. It was from her mother, Ruth, that Odessa learned the discipline that would define her whole life, not merely the arithmetic of ledgers, though she came to love columns of numbers the way other girls loved hymns, but the deeper conviction beneath the arithmetic that a thing's true value was never what a careless eye assigned it, but what patient attention could find in it. Her mother used to hold up a bent nail, a cracked cup, a bolt of cloth too plain for the church social, and say, "Odessa, tell me what's still good here before you tell me what's wrong." It became a kind of catechism between them. The girl learned to see past rust to iron still sound beneath it, past a torn hem to fabric still strong enough to be turned and hemmed again, past a dismissed animal or a dismissed person to whatever function or dignity remained. It was not sentimentality. Ruth Marsh was not a soft woman. She was a practical one, and she taught her daughter that mercy and thrift were, in the right hands, the very same skill. Odessa's father, Amos, added to this a different lesson, one born of the forge rather than the ledger, for though he called himself a farmer, he had trained as a blacksmith's apprentice in his youth in Kentucky before a bad harvest turned him toward the plow. And he kept a small forge behind the barn where he mended tools for neighbors who could not afford the trip into town. Odessa spent whole afternoons pumping the bellows for him as a girl, watching iron go from black and stubborn to a living, glowing orange, watching her father coax bent things straight again with patient, unhurried blows. "Fire doesn't destroy good iron," he told her once, wiping soot from his brow with the back of a scarred hand. "It only shows you what shape it's been hiding." She did not know, at 11 years old, pumping that bellows until her arms ached, that she was being prepared for a forge of her own. Decades later, in a town she had not yet heard of, holding a secret she could not have imagined, she married at 19. A steady, quiet man named Caleb Marsh, a distant cousin of no relation close enough to trouble the church. And together they moved west in 1855, with the tide of families seeking cheap land and new starts, settling at last in the Montana Territory on a modest claim near a spring-fed creek. They were not wealthy, but they were industrious. And Caleb, who had providentially learned some of his own father's trade as a wheelwright, found steady work, mending wagon wheels for the freight lines that passed through, while Odessa kept the household accounts, sold eggs and preserves at the town market, and slowly, patiently, built a small reputation as a woman who could stretch a dollar further than anyone else in the county and who never, in 17 years of marriage, let a debt go unpaid past its due season. They had one son, Nathaniel, who died of a fever at 4 years old and left a grief in Odessa that never fully closed, only scarred over, the way a burn scars over, tender to the touch for the rest of a life. They did not have other children. What they had instead was each other and the small, steady claim of land that Caleb had proved up and registered in his own name, with Odessa's name nowhere upon the deed, because that was simply how such things were done in those years. And neither of them thought to question it, not once. Not until it was far too late to matter. Caleb Marsh died in the spring of 1876, thrown from a spooked horse on the very road he had traveled 1,000 times without incident. And Odessa buried him beside their son on a hillside overlooking the creek. And for 6 months she managed the claim alone with a competence that surprised even herself, hiring a boy from town to help with the heaviest labor, keeping the books, keeping faith. It was Warwick Boone, Caleb's younger half-brother, who came that autumn with a lawyer's letter and a colder heart than Odessa had ever credited him with, informing her that as Caleb had died without a will and without children living, the claim passed by territorial law to his nearest blood relation, himself, and that she was welcome, out of Christian charity, to remain in the house until spring. She did not wait for spring. She would not eat charity from a man who watched her pack her mother's Bible into a carpetbag without offering to carry it to the wagon for her. She left in November with the $10 and $1 that would soon become the whole of her worldly fortune. And she rode the mail coach as far south and west as it would carry her, arriving at last, cold and friendless, in the town of Larkspur Hollow. Larkspur Hollow was not, in the winter of 1876, a thriving place. It had known better years. A silver strike 2 decades past had swelled it briefly to nearly 1,000 souls, with a proper hotel, 2 churches, and a main street of false-fronted buildings that still, in their peeling paint, remembered grander ambitions. But the silver had thinned, then failed, and the town had settled into the smaller, harder life of a farming and ranching community of perhaps 300, clinging to the railroad spur line that connected it, barely, to the wider world. It was a town, Odessa would come to understand, that carried an old wound it rarely spoke of aloud, 11 years earlier. In 1865, the town's single mining concern, the Larkspur Consolidated Claim, had been robbed of its entire season's payroll, some $6,000 in gold coin, an almost unthinkable sum for so small a place, on the very night it was to be distributed to the miners and merchants who depended on it. The robbery had ruined a dozen families outright and had never, in all the years since, been solved to anyone's full satisfaction, though the town had settled, with the particular cruelty of communities that need someone to blame, on the notion that their own blacksmith, a solitary, taciturn man named Elias Voss, had done it and fled. He had disappeared that same week, his forge locked up tight, and no one had seen him since. His name had become, in Larkspur Hollow, a kind of shorthand for betrayal. Mothers used him to warn children against trusting quiet strangers. And the forge itself, standing empty and closed on Anvil Street for 11 years, had become the town's own monument to the worst thing that had ever happened to it. It was into this town, then, that Odessa Marsh arrived with her carpetbag and her 10 remaining dollars, taking a single rented room above the mercantile and asking, with the same patient practicality her mother had taught her, what work might be found for a widow who could keep books, sew and manage a household better than most. The town clerk, a dry, not unkind man named Percival Odell, mentioned the forge to her almost as a joke on her third day in town, over coffee she could barely afford. When she pressed him about any property going cheap that a person with almost no capital might turn to some use. "There's the old Voss forge," he said, chuckling into his cup. "Been sitting locked 11 years. County's owned it since the taxes went unpaid, and nobody claimed it. I'd sell it for $10 just to be shut of the paperwork. Folks around here won't set foot near it. Say it's cursed. Say the thief's ghost still tends the fire at night." He meant it. Odessa understood later as a small cruelty disguised as wit. The way small towns sometimes test a stranger by offering her their worst bargain and watching whether she is fool enough to take it. She did not laugh. She thought of her father's hands closing bent iron. She thought of her mother holding up a cracked cup and asking what was still good in it. She thought of the fact that she possessed a trade, blacksmithing, learned at her father's elbow and practiced quietly, unofficially, for years alongside Caleb's wheelwright work. A trade that no one in this new town yet knew she carried in her own two capable hands. And she thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who has already lost everything and therefore has nothing left to fear losing, that a locked building with a bad reputation was, at minimum, a roof, a hearth, and 4 walls that might yet be turned to some honest use. "I'll take it," she told Percival Odell, and watched his amusement curdle into something like alarm as she counted out her $10, coin by coin, onto his desk, leaving herself with nothing, not 1 cent, to her name. The town watched her walk down Anvil Street the next morning with the rusted key Odell had produced from a drawer, as though handling something faintly unclean. And more than one curtain twitched in more than one window as the new widow pried open a door that had not opened in 11 years. The forge, when she stepped inside, exhaled a breath of cold ash and old iron that seemed to have been waiting, patiently, for someone willing to breathe it back in. Tools hung on the walls, exactly as their owner had left them, furred with rust and dust. A leather apron still hung on its peg, stiff and cracked with age. The great stone hearth sat cold and dark in the center of the room, and beside it, an anvil of good Swedish steel, dulled but not ruined, sat waiting the way anvils do, indifferent to the passage of years. It smelled, Odessa thought, not of curse or shame, as the town's gossip insisted, but simply of abandonment, of a life interrupted mid-motion and never resumed. She spent her first days clearing debris, sweeping 11 years of dust and mouse nest and cobweb from every surface. And it was on the 4th day, while scrubbing the soot-blackened stone of the chimney breast, that her hand found a brick that did not sit quite flush with its neighbors, a brick with a hairline seam around its edge too clean, too deliberate, to be the work of ordinary settling. She worked it loose with the flat edge of a fire iron, her heart beating with a curiosity she told herself was foolish, and behind it she found a small iron box, rusted at its hinges but sealed with a care that had clearly meant to keep its contents dry and safe for a very long time. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, she found a folded sheaf of papers in a steady, careful hand, a small leather pouch that, when she loosened its drawstring with trembling fingers, spilled out not gold, not coin, but a woman's wedding ring, plain gold, and a child's silver locket, and beneath the papers, a rough hand-drawn map of the hills behind the town, marked with symbols she did not yet understand. She sat on the cold hearthstone that evening with the papers spread across her knees by candlelight, and she read for the first time the words of Elias Voss, words that had waited 11 years in the dark for someone patient enough, or desperate enough to find them. The confession, for that was plainly what it was, began simply, "If any honest soul reads this, I write it so that my name might someday be cleared, though I do not expect to live to see that day myself." Elias Voss wrote that on the night of the Larkspur Consolidated robbery. He had not been the thief at all. but had been working late in his forge, alone. When he witnessed two riders he recognized, men employed by the mine's own paymaster, a man named Judge Corbin Ashe, who at that time held both the office of county judge and a controlling interest in the consolidated claim itself, moving a strongbox, not toward the mine office, where it belonged, but toward the hills behind town under cover of darkness. Voss, suspicious, had followed at a careful distance and had watched from concealment as the two men buried the strongbox, the entire season's payroll, $6,000 in gold, in a hollow beneath a split granite outcropping the locals called the Sentinel Rock, clearly intending to discover its theft the following morning and claim the insurance and sympathy of a robbed town while the gold waited quietly in the hills for Ashe to retrieve it at his leisure. Once suspicion had cooled, Voss, horrified and uncertain whom he could safely tell, for Ashe was, after all, the law in Larkspur Hollow, and his own word carried little weight against a judge's, had made a fatal error of judgment. Rather than speak at once, he had waited, gathering courage, intending to write to the territorial marshal in the capital rather than trust a local magistrate who was himself the thief. But before he could send that letter, Ashe's men had come for him in the night, beaten him near to death behind his own forge, and warned him that his forge, his life, and anyone he loved would burn if he spoke a single word of what he'd seen. Voss, then a widower himself with a young daughter sent to live with kin in Ohio for her own safety, had understood that he could not fight Judge Ashe alone and could not prove his story without risking everything, and so in fear and in grief, he had done the one thing he believed might someday set the matter right without costing him his life outright. He had gone, alone, one moonless night, and dug up the strongbox himself, moved the gold to a second, better hidden location he marked only on the map now in Odessa's hands, and fled the territory entirely, allowing the town to believe him the thief rather than risk exposing Ashe while Ashe still held every institution of power in the county. "I am a coward for the manner in which I did this," Voss had written. "But I could not think how else to keep the gold from a corrupt man's pocket without also getting myself killed and my daughter, orphaned entire. I have sealed this account, and the map to where the payroll truly lies, in the one place I trust no one shall think to look, my own forge, which the town will surely believe cursed by my name long after I am gone. Whoever finds this, I beg you, see that the gold is returned to the families it was owed to. And see, if it is not too late, that my name is spoken again without shame." Odessa read the confession 3 times that night by candlelight, and she wept, not for the gold, which she scarcely allowed herself to think of yet, but for the lonely, frightened man who had chosen disgrace over danger to those he loved and had died, for she felt certain, reading the trembling decline of his handwriting across the final pages, that he had written this near the end of a life cut short, without ever knowing whether his gamble had done any good at all. She thought of her own name, struck from a deed by a man who valued convenience over truth, and she felt something kindred and fierce kindle in her chest for a stranger she had never met and never would. She did not act rashly. She understood, from the confession itself, that Judge Corbin Ashe's name still carried weight in Larkspur Hollow. Indeed, she had already heard him spoken of respectfully in the Mercantile, a still influential man now in his 60s, who had long since sold his interest in the played-out, consolidated claim but remained the county's senior judge and its most prosperous citizen, owning the bank, half the ranch land in the valley, and a controlling voice on the town council. To accuse such a man on the word of a dead blacksmith's confession and a hand-drawn map would, she understood, be to invite ruin upon herself far swifter than any she had already suffered. So she did what her mother had taught her to do with any doubtful thing. She examined it patiently, from every angle, before she trusted it with her whole weight. She spent the following weeks living quietly above the Mercantile, working by day to clean, and reopen the forge under the plausible cover of an honest trade. For she was, in truth, a fine blacksmith, and Larkspur Hollow, like most frontier towns, had genuine need of one. Its horses going unshod and its plows unmended since old Voss's disappearance had left a gap no one had filled. She mended a neighbor's gate hinge for a few cents, then a rancher's broken wagon axle for $1, and word spread through the small, curious town that the strange new widow at the cursed forge could work iron as well as any man, twice her size. And slowly, cautiously, business came to her, coin by coin, and she began, for the first time in months, to eat regularly and sleep without the particular fear of the entirely destitute. But in her evenings, by lamplight, she studied Voss's map against her own careful walks in the hills behind town on Sundays, comparing his marks to the actual granite formations she found there, cross-referencing what details she could glean from the town's oldest residents about the layout of the country before the mine had scarred it, and building, patiently, a case as solid as any ledger she had ever balanced. It was Percival Odell, oddly enough, who first noticed her curiosity had a shape to it, catching her one afternoon at the county record's office poring over old survey maps of the hills. And though he was a dry man, he was not an unkind one, and something in her careful, methodical questions, never quite revealing what she sought, but circling closer to it with each visit, persuaded him to help rather than hinder her. It was through his records that she confirmed what Voss's confession had claimed, that Corbin Ashe had indeed held a majority interest in the Larkspur Consolidated Claim in 1865, an interest he had quietly sold off within 18 months of the robbery, at a price that, Odell admitted after some study, seemed oddly generous for a played-out claim recently robbed of its operating capital, as though the buyer, too, had somehow known the mine's fortunes would not truly suffer as badly as the town believed. Odessa understood, by the time the mountain aspens had gone gold that autumn, that she held in her hands not merely a treasure map but the means to unmake a lie that had stood 11 years and to remake entirely the reputation of a man the whole town had agreed to despise. She understood also that she could not do this alone, and it was this necessity that finally forced her, on a cold evening in late September, to walk to the small clapboard house of the town's young doctor, Thomas Renfield, a man not yet 40, respected but not yet powerful enough to be dangerous to cross, who had treated her for a burned hand earlier that month and had struck her, in their brief exchange, as a person of genuine decency, and to lay the whole matter before him, the confession, the map, and her plan, trusting him with a secret that could, if it went wrong, cost them both dearly. Word travels in small towns the way fire travels in dry grass, and it was not 3 weeks before whispers reached Corbin Ashe himself that the widow at the old Voss forge had been asking pointed questions about old mining records and old maps, and Ashe, whatever guilt he carried, had not survived and prospered for 11 years by ignoring such whispers. He came to her forge himself on a gray October afternoon, dressed in the fine black coat of a man who wished to remind the town, and her, exactly who he was, and he was, Odessa found, courteous in the particular way of powerful men accustomed to courtesy costing them nothing. He admired her work on a neighbor's wagon wheel, complimented the tidiness she had brought to a building the town had long considered an eyesore, and then, almost gently, suggested that a woman alone, new to Larkspur Hollow, might do well not to go digging into old, painful matters best left buried, matters that, he said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, had already cost the town enough grief without a stranger stirring old ashes. For her own curiosity's sake, she understood the threat beneath the courtesy as clearly as if he had shouted it, and she felt, standing in her own forge with soot on her hands and Elias Voss's confession locked in a strongbox, beneath her floorboards, a fear entirely reasonable given what she now knew. This man had already done to silence one honest witness, but she felt also, rising beneath the fear, the same steady iron her father had taught her to find beneath rust, the same patient conviction her mother had taught her to trust. "I appreciate your concern, Judge," she told him, meeting his eyes without flinching, "but I've found that old ashes sometimes hide the very coal a person needs to warm a cold house. I don't intend to stir anything that isn't already smoldering. Ash left without another word, but Odessa understood, watching his fine black coat retreat down Anvil Street, that she had perhaps a matter of days, not weeks, before he moved against her more directly than veiled courtesy. She spent the following 3 days in a fever of careful preparation, working with Dr. Renfield and, at his cautious suggestion, with the town's aging Methodist minister, Reverend Josiah Prine, a man old enough to remember the robbery firsthand and respected enough to be believed when he vouched for a stranger's character. Together, the 3 of them rode out before dawn on the 4th day to the second location marked on Voss's map, not the Sentinel Rock itself, where Ash's men had first buried the strongbox and which Odessa suspected might still be watched, but a smaller, harder-to-find hollow beneath a fallen deadfall pine a half-mile further into the hills, where Voss had moved the gold in his single desperate act of 11 years past. They dug in the cold gray light of early morning with borrowed spades, Odessa's arms aching in a way that reminded her, strangely and not unpleasantly, of pumping her father's bellows as a girl and a foot and a half down. Wrapped in what remained of decayed canvas sacking, they found it, the strongbox, rusted through in places, but its contents, gold coin, some $6,000 worth, exactly as Voss's confession had promised, still intact, still gleaming dully when Reverend Prine pried the corroded lid free with a trembling, reverent hand. They did not celebrate. Odessa understood, kneeling in the cold dirt with a fortune spread before her that could, with a single dishonest choice, have made her wealthy beyond anything she had known even before Warwick Boone had cast her out. She understood, with the same clarity that had guided every choice of her life, that this gold was never truly hers to keep, no more than it had ever been Corbin Ash's to steal. It belonged to the town, to the families who had gone hungry and lost their homesteads in the 11 winters since it vanished, and it belonged, in a deeper sense, to the memory of a frightened blacksmith who had sacrificed his own name and his own life's peace to keep it from a thief's pocket. She wrapped the confession, the map, and a careful accounting of the gold's discovery, and she brought the whole matter, that same evening, not to Judge Ash, whose authority she no longer trusted, but to the territorial marshal's office in the county seat, traveling there herself by hired wagon with Dr. Renfield at her side as witness, refusing to let the gold or the confession out of her sight for even a single night. The investigation that followed moved with the peculiar speed of frontier justice. Once a territorial marshal's pride and reputation became attached to a case, for the marshal, a stern man named Deacon Holt, had no love lost for a county judge who had for years operated with an independence Holt found personally galling, and Voss's confession, cross-checked against the very records Percival Odell had helped Odessa gather, against the suspiciously generous sale of Ash's mining interest, against the testimony of 2 of Ash's former hired men who, faced with federal questioning and the prospect of hanging for their part in an old man's beating, proved considerably less loyal to their former employer than Ash had perhaps counted on. The whole rotten structure of the old lie came down within a matter of weeks. Corbin Ash was arrested that November on charges of theft, conspiracy, and assault, and though his money bought him a lighter sentence than true justice might have demanded, it could not buy back the respect of a town that had, for 11 years, unknowingly honored their true thief while cursing the name of the one honest man who had tried, however imperfectly, to stop him. The gold, $6,000 restored to the town's own accounts under the careful, transparent stewardship of Reverend Prine and a committee Odessa herself insisted include Percival Odell for his honesty and Dr. Renfield for his standing, was distributed that winter to the families still owed their 11-year-old wages, with a portion set aside, at Odessa's own quiet, firm insistence, over the objection of a few who thought she deserved a finder's share for herself, to rebuild the town's derelict school and to erect, on Anvil Street itself, a small stone marker bearing the name of Elias Voss, blacksmith, with an inscription that reads simply, "He kept faith when it cost him everything." Odessa took no gold for herself, not one coin of the 6,000, though the town, ashamed now of its old cruelty and its old cursed talk, would gladly have pressed a fortune upon her. She she told Reverend Prine when he pressed her gently on the matter. Only what she had already begun to build with her own two hands, a trade honestly worked, a forge honestly kept, a name that belonged to no man's charity and no man's convenience, but her own. And so the forge that had cost her every last cent she possessed became, within that single winter, the beating heart of Larkspur Hollow's slow renewal, for a town that rebuilds its school and clears an innocent man's name, and returns 11 years of stolen wages to grieving families, does not remain a broken place for long. And Odessa Marsh, blacksmith, found herself, by the following spring, not merely solvent, but genuinely respected. Her forge busy from dawn past dusk with honest work, her name spoken in the mercantile, and the churchyard not as a curiosity, but as a woman. The whole town had come, quietly and completely, to trust, she thought often, in the years that followed, of the strange, quiet symmetry of her own life folded into Elias Voss's, a woman cast out of her rightful home, by a man who valued convenience over truth, finding her restoration in the very forge of a man destroyed by exactly such a lie. She had come to Larkspur Hollow with $10 and nothing else in the world, believing, as the whole town believed, that she was buying nothing but a curse and a cold hearth. She had not been foolish, though every soul in town had thought her so on that first cold morning, watching her carry a rusted key down Anvil Street toward a door no one else would touch. She had simply done what her mother taught her, all those years before, holding up a cracked cup and asking what was still good in it. She had looked past what the world had already decided to discard, and she had found, waiting patiently in the dark for 11 long years, a man's honest confession, a town's stolen fortune, and, though she would not have named it so plainly herself, the shape of her own restoration. Settle in, we had told you at the start, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh, and now you know it whole. A woman who bought a curse for $10 and found, instead, that some things the world calls worthless are only waiting for someone patient enough to see what shape they've been hiding. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Odessa Marsh. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to be reminded that overlooked things and overlooked people often carry more worth than the world is willing to credit them. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everybody else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we'd be honored to know your story too. Until next time, stay close.